Hi, welcome back to Educator.com. This is the lesson on cellular transport. So when we talk about cellular transport, there are two main categories, passive or active. We're going to start with passive transport, which is the transport that happens across the membranes of cells without the use of energy. It's a very natural thing. So this is the natural movement of substances in nature without the input of energy. You don't need ATP. You don't need to force molecules against where they're going. It just happens naturally. And it's about particles bumping into each other and kind of spreading out over time. So it's movement from a high concentration to a low concentration, whether it's solute or solvent. So solute, this is particles dissolved in water. So we'll talk about diffusion in a bit. Diffusion is passive transport of particles in water or air, but the term solute is usually used to describe something dissolved in water. Salt, sugar, food coloring, a lot of different things. And then solvent is the H2O. That is nature's solvent. Now, in other disciplines of science, you'll talk a lot about other solvents, other liquid substances, but water, that's the classic solvent for biology. So sometimes we talk about diffusion of the solvent, which is actually osmosis. Talk about more about that in a later slide. So passive transport is the opposite of active transport. Like I said, active transport would be the use of energy, forcing molecules against what's called the concentration gradient. So let me give you an example of passive transport, a practical example, one you could do at home. So this is a container with water in it. So here's a bunch of solvent. We're going to put solute in there. So this is a bunch of red food coloring, dye. And then on this side, on the right-hand side, we're going to put a bunch of blue food coloring and just let it sit. We're not going to mess with it. We're not going to stir it because that would be applying energy, right? We'd be, adding a force in there to expedite the process. But if we just let it stay, you can probably guess what's going to happen. The red spreads out, the blue spreads out, and we get a purple solution. Yeah, and if you know enough about, paints and the color wheel, you've heard of this, red and blue makes purple. And I don't want you to think that once, the blue spreads out and once the red spreads out, they just stay still. There's still going to be movement of the food coloring molecules around, but there's no net movement. So the term no net movement means that if you kind of measure everything as it is in the whole system, you don't have a significant change in where things are. And across a membrane, this will make more sense. I'm going to give you some examples of that later on in this lesson. You can still have red food coloring and blue food coloring kind of moving around. They're not static. But there's no net movement all in all in the whole solution. And it's reached what's called dynamic equilibrium. And I'll bring up that term a little bit later.